What if the gods didn't abandon Earth? They just stopped speaking. What if those towering ziggurats across ancient Mesopotamia weren't monuments to departed deities, but waiting rooms for a conversation that slowly faded into silence? Picture this: priests climbing stone steps at dawn, year after year, century after century, maintaining temples for gods who no longer answered. Not because they left, but because the frequency changed. Tonight, we're heading into one of history's strangest mysteries, weaving together sleep, archaeology, and the old memories of forgotten worlds. I make sleep documentaries about the Anunnaki and the Sumerians, diving into these ancient riddles, all while helping you relax and drift off. If you like wandering through time with me, hit like and subscribe for more late-night journeys into the weird corners of human history. Now just close your eyes for a second. Picture yourself in the endless desert of southern Iraq. The Tigris and Euphrates used to turn all that dust into a kind of paradise. The winds blowing, sand swirling over ruins that have waited 5,000 years for someone to listen. Down there, under your feet, clay tablets sit in the dark. Someone pressed wedge-shaped marks into them, thinking they were writing down the end of something. Not the end of the world, the end of hearing. The Sumerians didn't say the gods vanished. They said the gods grew distant, harder to reach, tougher to please. Suddenly you needed complicated rituals, desperate prayers, ceremonies that dragged on just to get close to what their ancestors managed with a simple gift. You can see it in the writing if you know how to look. Everything fatting out. A slow dimming like a radio signal slipping away. But before we fall any deeper into this mystery, I want to know, where are you right now? What time is it as you're listening? Drop a comment. I love seeing this story reach people all over the world. We're scattered across the map, but we're all curious about the same ancient questions. Where did we really come from? What did those long ago people actually know? Now settle in. Get comfortable. This is a long journey and there's no rush. The ancient world waited millennia for someone to ask these questions. It can wait a little longer while you find the perfect position for sleep. Let's begin where the silence began, in the temples. Part 1. The Chang Voice of Heaven. Back in 1889, the University of Pennsylvania sent John Punnett Peters, an archaeologist, to dig up the ruins of Nippur. Nobody expected him to find what you might call a library of silence. There he was, standing in the heat of Iraq, watching workers pull thousands of clay tablets out of ancient temple rooms. These tablets had been sitting there for over 4,000 years, holding stories about gods, kings, rituals, and the endless details of daily religious life. But something caught Peter's attention. The oldest tablets pulled from the deepest layers talked about gods appearing in person. Kings saw them while awake, right there in the courtyard, chatting face to face like neighbors talking about the weather. As Peters went through tablets from later years, the language shifted. Suddenly, the gods showed up only in dreams, then through omens, then only through complicated rituals, with priests squinting at entrails or reading the stars, trying to figure out what the gods really meant. The gods hadn't disappeared, but their voices had faded, changed frequency, you could say. Peters didn't realize what he was holding. For him, these were artifacts to sort, translate, and ship back to the university's Babylonian collection. But baked right into those tablets was a record of something slipping away, a civilization slowly waking up to the fact that its connection to the divine had changed in some deep, unsettling way. Picture being a priest at Nippur's temple of Enlil, around 2500 BCE. You've spent your life learning the same hymns your ancestors sang, performing rituals so old nobody remembers who started them. Every morning you wake the god's statue with songs, wash its face, dress it in linen, offer bread, beer, roasted meat. But hear what keeps you up at night. In the temple archive, your great-grandfather's journal describes the gods showing up regularly, solid, real, eating the offerings, drinking the beer, speaking out loud, no interpreter needed. Those tablets still exist. You've read them. They treat these visits like they're nothing special, just part of the daily routine. In your own life, 30 years in service and not once have you seen the god move. Never heard that voice. The statue stands there, beautiful, silent. You go through the motions, say the prayers, but something's changed. You know the god is real, no doubt. The offerings disappear overnight, sure, carried off by temple servants and handed out as sacred food. The ritual still works. The god is present. But now it's quieter, that's the truth. If you look at the tablets at the University of Pennsylvania, you can trace this shift. The oldest Sumerian texts, say 3000 BCE, talk about gods walking among people just as casually as you'd mention your neighbor dropping by. Enki, the god of wisdom, travels to Eridu to talk irrigation with the king. Inanna pops into Uruk to discuss politics. These aren't dreams or metaphors. They're written up with the same matter-of-fact tone used for recording shipments of barley. One tablet from about 2600 BCE has King Gilgamesh arguing with Inanna about marrying her. They trade insults. She threatens him. He refuses, plain and simple. It reads like a heated conversation, not some cryptic vision you need a priest to explain. Fast forward 300 years, same city, different tone. Now the kings meet the gods only in dreams, and those dreams need a team of priests to decode. The dreams are complicated, full of symbols. The king dreams of a falling star, and suddenly everyone's debating whether it means victory or disaster. That directness is gone. Jump to 2000 BCE, and the temple texts describe rituals that are almost like technical manuals. If you want to open the gate to the gods, you need the right offerings, at the right time, with the right chants, down to the tiniest detail. It's all about timing, astronomy, and technique. Specialists train for years just to get it right, just to create the possibility that the gods might respond. Might respond, not will. The certainty has vanished. So what happened in that 1,000-year gap, from 3000 to 2000 BCE? How did direct encounters with gods turn into something that demanded expert interpreters and complex rituals, just to maybe get a sign? The tablets never spell it out, but they track the change, layer by layer, tablet by tablet. You can almost feel the silence growing. Let's sit with this for a moment. Picture yourself in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's basement archives, which house over 30,000 tablets from Nippur. The room is climate-controlled, kept cool to preserve clay that survived 4 millennia in the Iraqi desert but might crumble in humid Philadelphia air. You're wearing cotton gloves as you carefully turn a tablet, feeling its weight, seeing the impression of each cuneiform mark where a reed stylus pressed into soft clay before it was baked hard as stone. This particular tablet is a hymn to Enlil, the supreme god of the Sumerian pantheon. It's dated to approximately 2100 BCE during the 3rd dynasty of Ur. The hymn is beautiful, poetic, praising the god's power over storms and his authority over all creation. But notice what's not there. No mention of the god appearing. No description of his physical presence. Instead, the hymn focuses on his distant dwelling, the great mountain where he resides far from human cities, where his word is pronounced and then carried down to earth by lesser deities and priests. He's there but somewhere else, reachable but through intermediaries. Compare this to a hymn from 800 years earlier also praising Enlil. That one describes the god striding through Nippur, inspecting the city, entering the temple, sitting on his throne. Present tense, physical presence. The difference is subtle but absolutely crucial. The god hasn't left, but the direct access has ended. Now here's where it gets truly intriguing. This pattern isn't unique to Enlil or to Nippur. It appears across all the major Sumerian and later Babylonian cities, in tablets describing all the major deities. By the 2nd millennium BCE, every god has retreated into a more distant mode of presence. They haven't abandoned their cities or their people. Their temples remain active, richly funded, politically powerful, but the nature of divine presence has fundamentally changed. The tablets use a specific phrase repeatedly during this transition period. The gate is closed. Not locked, not destroyed, not removed, closed, implying it could potentially be opened again with the right technique, the right knowledge, the right conditions. The priests spent centuries developing increasingly sophisticated methods to open that gate. Astronomical timing became crucial. They tracked the movements of Venus with obsessive precision because certain celestial alignments were believed to create favorable conditions for divine contact. They developed pharmacological knowledge, creating incense blends from rare materials that might alter consciousness in ways that made the closed gate more permeable. They never stopped trying. That's what makes this story so haunting. Imagine the dedication required to maintain these practices for 1,000 years, generation after generation, while divine contact became increasingly rare and increasingly difficult. Imagine the faith needed to keep believing, keep trying, keep performing rituals that your grandfather told you his grandfather had seen work, but that in your own lifetime produced only silence. Yet they persisted. The temples remained open. The offerings continued. The priesthood expanded, became more specialized, more technically sophisticated. As direct divine presence faded, human knowledge increased to bridge the gap. Astronomy, mathematics, pharmacology, ritual choreography, all advancing because the gods had become harder to reach. What if this wasn't decline? What if this was exactly the point? What if the Anunnaki didn't leave? They deliberately shifted to a different frequency, forcing humanity to develop the technical knowledge necessary to eventually establish contact on their own terms. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand what that original contact looked like, before the gates closed, before the silence began, before the frequency changed. The first frequency, when gods walked in daylight. The earliest Sumerian tablets, those dating to the very beginning of writing around 3200 BCE, don't describe how divine contact began. They assume it. They take for granted that gods are physically present in cities, living in temples, eating the food offered to them, making decisions about human affairs. There's no origin story for divine presence because from the Sumerian perspective, it had always been that way. But the tablets do describe what that presence looked like day to day. In the city of Eridu, the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in Mesopotamia, archaeologists from the Oriental Institute in Chicago excavated 17 successive temple layers, one built atop another, stretching back to 5400 BCE. The deepest temple, Temple I, was a simple shrine barely large enough for one person, but it sat in exactly the same location as Temple XVI, built 3,000 years later, a massive complex with multiple chambers. For 3 millennia, through thousands of rebuilding projects, they maintained the exact same sacred spot. Why? Because according to the tablets, that spot marked where Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet water, first established contact with humans. That specific location was where the boundary between the divine and human worlds was thinnest, where Enki could cross over, become physically present, interact directly with his priests and the city's rulers. The Eridu tablets describe Enki's presence matter-of-factly. He dwells in the temple. He teaches humans irrigation techniques. He solves disputes. He provides medical knowledge. The language is administrative, almost boring in its routine acknowledgement of divine presence. Like a modern organization might say, the CEO was in the office today and approved these projects. This wasn't mysticism. This was documentation. One tablet fragment from early Eridu, preserved at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes a water distribution problem. 2 neighboring fields were disputing irrigation rights. The case was brought before Enki's temple. According to the tablet, Enki himself examined the landscape, measured the elevation, and prescribed a solution that ensured fair water distribution to both fields. The tablet then lists the measurements Enki specified and notes that his decision resolved the dispute. Read that again. A god personally surveyed land and made engineering decisions about water flow. and someone wrote it down as casually as you might document a city council meeting. This was the first frequency, divine presence as administrative reality. Similar tablets exist for other cities and other gods. Inanna, the goddess of Uruk, appears frequently in early texts making decisions about the city's political alliances. The texts describe her debating with the king about which neighboring cities to befriend or conquer. She has opinions. She argues. She sometimes loses arguments, suggesting that even divine wisdom wasn't considered absolutely binding. These aren't worship texts, they're procedural documents. The detail that makes this even stranger: the tablets distinguish between the god's physical presence and the god's statue. When Enki was present in Eridu, he sat beside his statue. When he was absent, the priests performed rituals for the statue, maintaining it as if the god might return at any moment to occupy it. They understood the difference between the divine being and the physical representation. The statue was a placeholder, a focal point for worship when direct presence wasn't available. But in the earliest periods, according to the tablets, direct presence was available, regularly, predictably. Let's imagine what that meant practically. You're a young priest in Eridu around 3000 BCE. You're in training, learning the rituals and hymns, memorizing the proper procedures for maintaining the temple. One morning, you're sweeping the temple courtyard when the high priest hurries past, looking nervous and excited. "Enki is coming today," he says. "Clean that faster." You've heard the older priests talk about this, but you've never experienced it yourself. You sweep frantically, your heart pounding. What does it mean, Enki is coming? How does a god arrive? An hour later, you find out. There's no lightning, no earthquake, no supernatural announcement, just a figure walking up the temple steps, accompanied by two priests. The figure is tall, dressed in distinctive robes you've only seen in temple artwork. His beard is braided in an elaborate style. His eyes are difficult to look at directly, though you can't quite explain why. They're just eyes, human eyes, but there's something about them that makes you want to look away. He enters the temple without ceremony and sits in the chair next to the statue. The high priest brings him bread and beer. He eats, he drinks, he wipes his mouth. Then he starts talking about the irrigation canals. For 3 hours, Enki discusses water management with the city's engineers and the king. His knowledge is encyclopedic. He knows the elevation of every field, the capacity of every canal, the flood patterns of the Euphrates going back decades. When he makes suggestions, people write them down frantically. This is precious information from someone who understands hydraulics with impossible depth. At sunset he stands, says he'll return in 3 months, and walks out of the temple. You watch him descend the steps and you lose track of him. One moment he's there, the next moment your eyes can't quite locate him in the gathering darkness. He didn't vanish dramatically. He just stopped being easy to track visually. The high priest glances over, catches your bewildered look, and just grins. "You'll get used to it," he says. "He comes every quarter, has for longer than anyone can remember. Next time, be ready, take good notes." That was how it started. Gods showing up on a schedule. They'd walk in for consultations, practical advice, a little guidance. They acted as advisors, teachers, city administrators. You might spot one now and then, and sure, it was a big deal, but not the kind of thing that made people faint. Still, everyone knew their power was on another level, way beyond anything human. For centuries, the tablets just laid it all out. No drama, just records. Enki in Eridu, Inanna in Uruk, Nanna in Udu in Larsa. Each god tied to a city, each one visiting often enough that scribes kept track, who showed up, what they decided, how they steered the city. Then, somewhere around 2800 BCE, you start to notice a shift in the records. The visits slow down. The stories get hazier, less about the gods standing right there, more about visions and dreams. By 2600 BCE, the tablets talk about gods showing up in dreams more than in broad daylight. By 2400 BCE, a god appearing in person is rare, a huge deal, worthy of a special festival. By 2000 BCE, that's done. No more scheduled appearances. But the gods, they're not gone. Temples stay busy, priests still serve. Statues get offerings every day. Festivals go on. The gods still run the show. At least on paper. But those regular physical face-to-face meetings, gone, vanished. Why? The tablets don't spell it out. They just record the change. Unless you pay close attention. Because if you do, you'll spot new phrases popping up all over the tablets from that time. Things like, the god has retreated to his holy mountain, or she has ascended to her exalted dwelling. Most often, you see, the god is present but not seen. Present but not seen. Not gone, still there, just somewhere else. A step removed, behind a gate that only opens if you know the right tricks. There's a tablet at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, came out of Nippur, dated to about 2300 BCE. It describes a new ritual invented for one purpose, to call the god down from his mountain. It's not simple. 7 days of purification, precise timing with the stars, special offerings, complicated prayers. The text says Enlil himself taught this ritual before he withdrew, gave people a way to keep the connection going, even after he stopped showing up in person. Look at that for a second. Before stepping back, the god teaches the priests how to open the gate again, just for a moment. He hands them the tools to reach up and make contact, even though he's decided not to walk among them anymore. Why would the Anunnaki do this? Why stick around for thousands of years, then suddenly switch to a version of contact that forces humans to master astronomy, mathematics, and ritual just to say hello? Maybe that's the whole point. Maybe the first phase, physical presence, was just training wheels, and the real goal was the second phase, presence hidden behind a veil where you have to work, learn, and reach up if you want to connect. Teaching humans to seek, not just receive. But before we get into why the gods made this change, we have to look at what happened right before everything shifted. Because around 2800 BCE, the tablets hint at something big, just fragments, nothing direct. The Sumerians called it the decision of the assembly. All the Anunnaki gathered and voted to change the rules of contact. And at least one god didn't agree, so strongly that he broke rank and handed humans the secrets for opening the gate, even though the others said no. We'll get to that story. For now, picture this. Temples all over Mesopotamia, still thriving centuries after the gods stopped showing up in the flesh because the priests believed, absolutely believed, the gods were still there. Just on another frequency. And inside those temples, in rituals passed down for centuries, in astronomical knowledge that seems impossible for the time, in math that's way more precise than any farmer needs. The codes are still there, waiting for someone to figure them out. Part 2, the Assembly's decision. There's a tablet tucked away in the archives of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago that really bothers some scholars. They call it. It comes from Lagash and is about 4,400 years old. For years, experts just lumped it in with mythological literature, a flowery poem about gods making cosmic decisions. But then Samuel Noah Kramer, a guy who spent his life knee-deep in Sumerian tablets, spotted something off about A7768 back in 1967. The language felt different. It wasn't poetic or lofty. It was dry and matter-of-fact, almost like someone jotting down meeting notes. Basically, the tablet describes the Anunnaki, Sumerian gods, holding a big assembly in Nippur to tackle what they kept calling the human problem. That phrase pops up again and again. Mushkanu, the human problem. The text lists who showed up, who spoke first, what arguments they made. There's none of the usual drama or thunderous divine speeches, just a no-nonsense record of a meeting where big decisions were made. So what was the problem? According to A7768, humans had multiplied way beyond what the gods expected. The original 5 cities, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, had ballooned into a bunch of new settlements. The population exploded. With that came all sorts of new complications the Anunnaki hadn't planned for. Humans were inventing things, creating their own twists on the knowledge they'd been given. They were, according to the tablet, difficult to shepherd. The gods argued about what to do. Enlil said, "Let's pull back." If the Anunnaki stepped away, maybe humans would have to rely on what they'd already been taught. It would test if people could keep civilization running on their own. Anu, the sky god who usually kept out of earthly business, went along with this. He figured the experiment had worked. Urban civilization had taken root, and now it was time for humans to prove they could handle things without constant babysitting. Enki wasn't convinced. He pushed back, saying people weren't ready to go it alone. They still needed guidance, especially with technical stuff, irrigation, metalworking, astronomy. If the gods left too soon, civilization would fall apart. The assembly voted. Enlil's plan won. The Anunnaki would move to a higher dwelling. They wouldn't walk among humans anymore, though people could still reach out to them with the right rituals. But the age of gods mingling with mortals, that was over. Enki officially disagreed. The tablet actually records his words, "I will not abandon my children." And here, where things get interesting, A7768 isn't a one-off. Tablets from other cities tell the same story, a divine assembly, a big decision, Enki standing apart. The details shift, but the main plot never really changes. The gods decided to step back except for Enki. This moment shaped a lot of what came next in Sumerian religion. In Eridu, Enki's home turf, texts say their god didn't vanish with the others. While most Anunnaki retreated to their lofty abodes and stopped showing up in person, Enki set up something new. He made what the tablets call a house of wisdom under his temple, a secret chamber where certain priests could meet with him directly. That's where the mystery schools started. The Eridu tablets describe how, after the assembly's decision, a new class of priests sprang up. Initiates went through years of training in the sacred sciences, astronomy, math, medicine, architecture. These weren't just religious rituals. This was hardcore technical knowledge, taught in a curriculum that got more advanced as you went. And the tablets say this knowledge came straight from Enki. Not through dreams or vague inspiration, but in that underground chamber, face to face, if you'd earned it. Other cities tried to copy the idea. Nippur built a scribal academy that became the top center for Sumerian learning. Ur started an astronomy program that tracked the stars with a precision nobody matched until the Renaissance. Uruk's temples turned into massive libraries, keeping the old knowledge alive after the gods' withdrawal. But Eridu was different. Eridu claimed to maintain direct access. Archaeologists have never found this underground chamber. The water table in southern Iraq is high, making deep excavation under temple foundations extremely difficult. What has been found are references, tablets listing the descent to the House of Wisdom, priestly titles that specifically mention those who have entered below. Architectural descriptions of staircases descending from the temple's inner sanctuary to chambers that no longer exist, or that remain buried too deep to excavate with current technology. Imagine what this meant practically. While most of Mesopotamia adapted to the new reality of distant gods requiring elaborate rituals for contact, Eridu quietly maintained something closer to the old frequency. Not quite the scheduled physical appearances of the earlier period, but not the complete distance of the new arrangement either. A compromise, a middle frequency, hidden from public view, accessible only to initiates but still direct. The tablets describe the training process for these initiates with remarkable detail. 3 years of preliminary education in cuneiform writing, mathematics, and astronomical observation. 7 years of advanced study in sacred sciences. Then, if deemed ready, descent to the House of Wisdom for direct instruction from Enki himself. The tablets specify not a vision of Enki, not a dream visitation, direct instruction in an underground chamber where the god remained present even after his official withdrawal. This is where it gets interesting for modern researchers, because the knowledge that came out of Eridu during this period was extraordinary. Mathematical techniques that shouldn't have been developed until much later. Astronomical observations requiring telescopic precision, which obviously shouldn't have been possible. Medical procedures documented with sophistication that suggests direct anatomical knowledge. Where did this knowledge come from? The conventional archaeological answer is that Sumerian scientists were simply more advanced than we've given them credit for. Through careful observation and clever thinking, they developed impressive technical capability. But the tablets offer a different explanation. Enki continued teaching. Conventional archaeologists dismiss this as mythology. The advanced knowledge came from human ingenuity, and the myth of Enki's instruction is simply how ancient people explain their own achievements by attributing them to divine intervention. Maybe that's certainly the simpler explanation. But then you read the tablets describing the descent to the House of Wisdom, and something doesn't quite fit, because these aren't stories. They're instructional texts. They describe specific procedures for entering the chamber, specific preparations required, specific conditions that must be met. They read like access protocols, not mythology. One tablet from approximately 2200 BCE lists the requirements for descent. The initiate must fast for 7 days, consuming only water from the sacred well. On the 7th day at sunset, he must purify in the temple pool. He must descend alone, carrying no light. The descent requires 37 steps. At the bottom, he must speak the words taught him. I am the child of clay, seeking the wisdom of deep waters. He must wait in darkness until the gate is opened. That's not poetic metaphor, that's a procedure. And here's the haunting part. Tablets from other cities describing attempts to establish similar direct access often end with failure. Nippur tried to create a descent chamber in Enlil's temple around 2100 BCE. The project was abandoned. The tablets note only, the god did not open the gate. Attempted similar construction, same result. The gate remained closed. Only Eridu claimed success. Only Eridu's texts describe ongoing direct instruction from their god, even after the general withdrawal. Either Eridu was special, which the tablets claim, calling it the first city, the prototype, the place where divine human contact was initially established, or Eridu's priests were better at maintaining an elaborate fiction than any other city. But here's what troubles that second interpretation. The knowledge that came out of Eridu was verifiable. The irrigation techniques worked. The astronomical calculations were accurate. The medical procedures were effective. If the priests were inventing divine instruction as a cover for their own discoveries, they were remarkably good at it. Or Enki actually kept teaching. Let's sit with that possibility for a moment. Let's imagine the implications. The Anunnaki assembly decided to withdraw, to shift to a higher frequency that required humans to develop technical knowledge to access. But one member of that assembly, the one specifically associated with human welfare, with wisdom, with teaching, refused to fully comply. He found a workaround, a hidden channel, a back door. He taught the gate opening techniques to his priests. He maintained a physical location where direct instruction could continue. He ensured that even as the other Anunnaki withdrew completely, a thread of direct contact remained. Not defiance exactly, more like creative interpretation of the assembly's decision. Yes, he withdrew from public presence. Yes, he stopped appearing to kings and common people. But for initiates willing to undergo years of training and prove their dedication, a door remained open. A door that led down, not up to the heavens where the other gods had retreated, but down into the subterranean waters, the Abzu, Enki's original domain. The symbolism is perfect. As the other gods ascended to higher realms, Enki descended to deeper ones. As they became harder to reach from below, he he became accessible from beneath. Now, here's where conventional archaeology and the tablets disagree most sharply. Conventional archaeology says, around 2400 BCE, Sumerian civilization underwent a transition from the early dynastic period to the Akkadian Empire. Political centralization increased, bureaucratic sophistication grew, scientific and technical knowledge expanded because urban civilization had reached a level of stability that allowed for specialized scholarly pursuits. The increasing complexity of religious ritual during this period reflects growing institutional power of the priesthood, not actual changes in divine presence. The tablets say, around 2400 BCE, the Anunnaki withdrew. Direct physical presence ended. Complex rituals developed because they were necessary to maintain contact across a greater distance. Knowledge expanded because Enki continued teaching select initiates, ensuring that human technical capability would grow even without constant divine supervision. Same evidence, different interpretations. But what if both are partially correct? What if political and technical development happened exactly as archaeology describes, but the cause was what the tablets describe? What if humanity developed sophisticated civilization during this period precisely because divine presence became less available, forcing humans to build the infrastructure themselves? That's actually consistent with both accounts. Withdrawal forced development. Reduced divine presence created the necessity for human innovation. Except for Enki's back door, which ensured the innovation didn't happen blindly, which provided direct instruction to initiates who could then share that knowledge through teaching institutions. The tablets describe this explicitly. Priests who descended to the House of Wisdom in Eridu returned to teach at scribal schools across Mesopotamia. The knowledge flowed from Eridu outward. Irrigation techniques developed in Eridu spread to other cities. Astronomical observation methods pioneered in Eridu were adopted by temples throughout Sumer. Medical knowledge preserved in Eridu's libraries became standard practice across the region. If Enki's direct instruction was mythological, it was mythology with remarkable practical results. Or it was exactly what the tablets claim. One god maintaining direct contact through a hidden channel, teaching humanity the technical skills they'd need to maintain civilization without constant supervision, defying the assembly's decision because he believed humans deserved better than abandonment. From the Sumerian point of view, the real hero here isn't humanity piecing everything together on their own. It's Enki, the god who refused to just let people struggle. He kept teaching. He stayed close. He kept himself within reach. But he didn't make it easy. He hid. He limited his presence to a few initiates. He set things up so that if people wanted to reach him, they had to work for it. Discipline, dedication, real technical skill. You couldn't just stumble in. Maybe that was the whole idea. Not abandonment, but raising the bar for access. Here's the question that won't leave you alone. If Enki kept this secret channel open, this back door to wisdom, when did it finally close? Or did it ever close at all? Because those old tablets, the ones about descending to the House of Wisdom, they don't cut off at 2200 BCE. The stories keep going. Through the Akkadians, through Ur-II, right into the old Babylonian period. Even as late as 1600 BCE, people wrote about these descents, 8 centuries after the assembly supposedly sealed things off. 800 years of rumors, records, and claims that Enki still waited, hidden right under his temple in Eridu. So which is it? The world's longest-running religious fantasy, or the back door really did stay open, even after the other Anunnaki left, even after God stopped showing up everywhere else. Eridu held onto something the rest of Mesopotamia had already lost. But not forever. Eventually, even the Eridu texts go quiet. By 1400 BCE, the stories just dry up. No big finale, no explanation. The tablets just stop talking about the descent. The back door shut. The last shortcut was gone. The frequency changed one last time. Now humanity was truly alone. Sure, the libraries still held scraps of wisdom from the open gate days. The rituals stuck around, even as they lost their punch. Mystery schools tried to keep the old techniques alive, aimed at gods who had stopped answering for good. All that was left was memory and silence. Unless you looked closer, unless you saw that the silence wasn't a failure, that maybe the quiet was the point. Maybe the Anunnaki didn't abandon humanity. Maybe they graduated them. They handed over everything humans needed, then stepped back to watch what people would do with it. But that's if the silence was part of the plan. What if it was? What if something else happened? Something that forced the Anunnaki to leave on short notice, not as a lesson, but because they had no choice. Some tablets hint at exactly that. Fragments talk about a crisis, a conflict, a decision made in a moment of panic, not calm planning. Most scholars don't want to touch those stories. They suggest the Anunnaki didn't leave because they wanted to. They got called away, something urgent somewhere else. And they never came back. Part 3. The tablets of crisis. There's this group of ancient texts that archaeologists call the lamentation literature. Imagine Sumerian poets sitting down to write about the destruction of their cities, after wars, after disasters. These poems aren't just history. They're raw, haunting stories about loss, grief, and what it feels like to watch your world fall apart. Most of the time, these laments follow a familiar script. A city gets destroyed. The gods weep but don't step in. Survivors mourn, and eventually, with some divine nod, people start to rebuild. There's a pattern, a way of making sense of catastrophe by blaming fate, the gods, or both. It's the usual ancient story. Divine will meets human disaster. But sometimes, in the middle of all that, you get a few lines that don't quite fit, fragments that stand out. Scholars usually smooth these out in translation, making them line up with the rest of the genre. But if you take those lines at face value, well, suddenly things feel different. Take the lamentation over the destruction of Sumer and Ur. It's sitting in the Yale Babylonian collection, written around 2000 BCE, right after the fall of the Ur-III dynasty. Most of it is standard fare, divine abandonment, invading armies, smashed cities. But then there are these 3 lines. The great gods turned away their faces. The Anunnaki departed to a distant place. Even Enki sealed his house and followed them to the boundary. That 3rd line, even Enki sealed his house and followed them to the boundary. That's where things get weird. Enki is the outlier. Other texts say he stuck around when the rest left, kept a secret door open, kept his house of wisdom in Eridu accessible long after the others vanished. But here, he seals his house too. He leaves, and not just anywhere, he follows them to the boundary. Not to heaven, not to some lofty divine throne room. The boundary, it's a strange word, sounds like a real place, a border, the end of one world and the start of another. Usually, translators gloss over this, calling it the distant lands or the far horizon. It sounds poetic, like the gods just faded away into the unknown. But the Sumerian word is Her-Seglimu, boundary mountain, edge of territory. Not a metaphor, a specific spot. So if you read it straight, the gods didn't just drift away, they went somewhere, to the boundary mountain. Even Enki, who always stayed behind, left this time. This is 2000 BCE. If the text isn't just being poetic, it's marking a real moment. The last access point closed. Even the secret routes shut down. And you have to wonder, what happened at that boundary? What pushed even Enki, the one who always found a way to stay, to pack up and go? The text doesn't answer. It turns back to the usual, in ruins, people grieving, the endless human struggle. Nothing out of the ordinary for lamentation literature. But then there's another tablet from about the same era, now in the British Museum, BM 45,746. It's in bad shape, chunks missing, but what's left is unsettling. It talks about the Anunnaki gathering again, not to debate, not to plan, but to respond fast to a crisis. You get fragments like, arrived from the sky, bearing dire news. The decision cannot be delayed. All must return to. And that last bit cuts off. All must return to where, we don't know, the tablets broken there. Then it describes a rush, not the slow, sad withdrawal of before. This is an evacuation. The gods hurry. They seal their temples, say rushed goodbyes to their priests, promise to come back when the matter is resolved. Not if when. It's clear this wasn't a planned exit. It was an emergency. They meant to return. But what drove all the gods, even the holdouts like Enki, to leave at once? The answer is gone, lost with the missing pieces of clay. All that's left are these scattered lines, hints of a crisis, a sudden flight, the kind of event that shuts everything down. And after that, nothing. No stories of return, no tales of the problem getting fixed, just silence stretching from 2000 BCE all the way to now. 4,000 years of closed gates. Now, here's where we have to be very careful about interpretation, because these fragmentary texts can be read multiple ways. Reading 1. The traditional scholarly interpretation. These are poetic descriptions of the gods withdrawing from human affairs as Mesopotamian civilization entered a period of political instability and military conflict. The crisis is simply the human historical crisis, the fall of empires, invasion by foreign powers, the collapse of urban order. The gods withdrawing in poetry reflects human experience of losing divine protection during catastrophic events. Reading 2. The texts describe an actual event. Something happened around 2000 BCE that required all the Anunnaki, even Enki who'd maintained hidden presence, to depart suddenly. They intended to return when the matter is resolved, but never did. Either the matter couldn't be resolved, or they were prevented from returning, or the resolution took longer than expected, and by the time it was possible to return, human civilization had moved on without them. Reading 3. A synthesis. The Anunnaki's withdrawal was always planned, but the final closing of the last channels happened earlier than intended due to unforeseen circumstances. The emergency departure accelerated a process that was already underway, forcing complete separation before humanity was fully prepared for it. Which reading is correct? We can't know from the fragmentary evidence, but what we can track is what happened to the gate-opening rituals after this point. Because the rituals didn't stop, even after 2000 BCE, even after the texts suggest final departure, Mesopotamian temples continued performing elaborate ceremonies designed to open gates between human and divine realms. If anything, the rituals became more complex, more sophisticated, more desperate. As if the priests knew the gods had left but refused to accept that the departure was permanent. As if they believed that with sufficient precision, sufficient dedication, sufficient technical excellence, the gates could be forced open. Contact could be re-established. The University of Pennsylvania Museum holds hundreds of tablets describing these later rituals. They're fascinating documents because they reveal increasing technical sophistication combined with decreasing success. The rituals track astronomical events with incredible precision. They specify exact timing down to the hour. They prescribe complex incense formulas, specific musical notes to be played on specific instruments, choreographed movements for dozens of priests acting in perfect synchronization. These weren't simple prayers. These were technical procedures, engineering attempts to recreate conditions that once allowed divine presence. And according to the tablets, they stopped working around 2000 BCE. Priests continued performing them for another 1,000 years. By 1000 BCE, the Babylonian priesthood had developed rituals of such complexity that they required years of specialized training to execute correctly. But the texts from this period no longer describe successful divine contact. Instead, they describe perfect execution of ritual procedure, with the implicit understanding that perfect execution is its own goal, regardless of result. The gates were closed, but the gate opening ceremonies continued because the priesthood refused to admit they no longer worked. Or because the priests understood something we don't, that maintaining the technique was crucial even if it didn't currently produce results. That knowledge of how to open the gates needed to be preserved in case conditions changed, in case the matter was resolved and the Anunnaki returned, in case the frequency someday shifted back to a range humans could detect. Imagine being a priest in Babylon around 1500 BCE. You've trained for 15 years to perform the gate opening ceremony for the New Year festival. You know every word, every movement, every astronomical calculation required. You execute the ritual flawlessly, as your teachers taught you, as their teachers taught them, in an unbroken chain going back 1,000 years. But nothing happens. The statue of Marduk remains still. No presence descends. No voice speaks. The gates stay closed. Do you conclude the ritual doesn't work? That it never worked? That your ancestors were performing empty ceremonies based on fantasy? Or do you conclude that you performed it correctly, maintaining an ancient technique, preserving knowledge that might someday be needed again when conditions change? The Babylonian priests chose the second interpretation. They maintained the rituals for another 1,000 years, even as results became increasingly absent because they believed the knowledge itself was sacred. The gates might be closed now, but gates can reopen. Frequencies can shift back. The Anunnaki might return. And when they did, humanity needed to remember how to establish contact. This is actually a profound act of faith. Not faith that the ritual would work now, but faith that preserving the technique mattered for the future. An act of service to descendants who might live in an age when the gates opened again. By 500 BCE, even this faith was fading. The Persian conquest of Babylon brought foreign religious ideas that didn't include gate-opening rituals. The old Sumerian gods were reinterpreted as aspects of Ahura Mazda, the Persian supreme deity. The technical priesthood declined. The elaborate rituals simplified or were abandoned entirely. By the time Alexander the Great conquered Mesopotamia in 331 BCE, the gate-opening ceremonies had largely ceased. A few old priests in remote temples still performed abbreviated versions, but the knowledge was dying with them. By the Roman period, it was gone. The techniques for opening the gates between human and divine realms, preserved for 3,000 years after the gates had closed, finally lost to history. The silence became absolute. Or did it? Because there's one more collection of texts that complicates this story. These tablets aren't from Mesopotamia. They're from locations around the Mediterranean, Egypt, Greece, Anatolia. They're written in different languages, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Greek, Hittite. But they describe similar techniques. Mystery schools teaching gate-opening procedures. Initiation rituals designed to achieve contact with divine realms. Technical specifications for creating conditions where boundaries between human and divine could be temporarily dissolved. These texts are later than the Mesopotamian sources, dating from 1000 BCE to 300 CE, but they show remarkable similarities to the earlier Sumerian material. As if the knowledge hadn't died in Mesopotamia, it had simply moved elsewhere, carried by travelers, traders, priests fleeing declining cities. Carried west along trade routes, north to Anatolia, south to Egypt, into different cultures, different languages, different religious frameworks, but preserving core techniques. The Eleusinian mysteries in Greece, which operated for nearly 2,000 years, taught initiation procedures that included descent into underground chambers, fasting and purification, consumption of specific sacraments, all designed to achieve direct experience of divine presence. The parallels to the Eridu descent texts are striking. The Egyptian mystery schools taught similar techniques. The Hermetic tradition preserved gate-opening procedures in encrypted texts, hiding technical knowledge inside philosophical allegory. All of this persisted into the Christian era. When Christianity became dominant in the Mediterranean world, the mystery schools were suppressed as pagan heresy. But the knowledge went underground, preserved in fragmentary form by groups that would later be called Gnostics, alchemists, Hermeticists. Small communities maintaining ancient techniques, performing rituals designed to open gates that had been closed for thousands of years, preserving procedures that no longer seemed to work, but that they believed might someday be crucial again. The last known performance of a classical mystery school initiation happened in Athens in 396 CE, when the Christian emperor Arcadius ordered the Eleusinian sanctuary closed permanently. The priests performed the final ceremony, sealed the chamber, and walked away. But they didn't destroy the knowledge. They encoded it in texts, in symbols, in architectural designs, hidden in plain sight for anyone with the training to recognize it. And here we are, 4,000 years after the gates closed, still finding those encoded messages, still translating those tablets, still trying to understand what the Sumerians knew about opening channels to something they called the Anunnaki, still wondering if the silence is permanent or just temporary, if the frequency will ever shift back to a range we can detect, or if we need to do what the ancient priests attempted, develop sufficient technical knowledge to force the gates open ourselves. That's actually what they were trying to do, according to the later texts. The rituals became more sophisticated over time because the priests were attempting to compensate for changing conditions. If the Anunnaki had withdrawn to a higher frequency, the rituals needed to reach higher, required greater precision, more advanced astronomical timing, deeper understanding of the technical requirements for interdimensional contact. That sounds like modern science fiction, but read the actual tablets. Read the descriptions of what they were attempting. They're using ancient terminology and mythological framing, but the underlying concept is clear. Consciousness can be tuned like a radio receiver to pick up signals at different frequencies. The Anunnaki existed at a frequency that required specific conditions and properly trained consciousness to detect. When those conditions stopped occurring naturally, they needed to be artificially created through technical ritual procedure, which is exactly what the mystery schools taught. Techniques for altering consciousness to perceive realms normally hidden, methods for creating temporary conditions where gates could open. They believed it worked, at least sometimes. The texts describe successful initiations where the gate opened, contact was achieved, knowledge was transmitted. Whether those experiences were genuine contact with something external or internally generated mystical states, we can't determine from textual evidence alone. But the crucial point is, they didn't give up. For 3,000 years after the Sumerian texts say the gates closed, human beings continued developing and refining techniques for reopening them, continued believing that contact was possible with sufficient knowledge and dedication, continued maintaining a vigil, waiting for the frequency to shift back, or developing the technology to reach the new frequency themselves. And then Christianity arrived with a different model. One God accessible through faith and prayer, no technical training required, no mystery schools, no initiations, no gate-opening procedures, just believe, pray, and you're connected. Simple, democratic, available to everyone without years of specialized training. And it destroyed 3,000 years of accumulated knowledge about the technical requirements for interdimensional contact. Because if connection to the divine realm is simple faith, then complex ritual procedures are unnecessary. The mystery schools were disbanded. Their libraries were burned. Their techniques were lost or driven so far underground that they became folklore and superstition. By 500 CE, the knowledge was effectively extinct. A few fragments preserved here and there, encoded in texts that most readers no longer understood, hidden in architectural designs that looked decorative but contained technical information, buried in artwork that appeared symbolic but was actually instructional. The gates had been closed for 2,500 years, and now the knowledge of how to open them was also gone. Complete silence, complete separation, the Anunnaki withdrawn to wherever they'd gone. Humanity left with only mythological memory of a time when gods walked among us, when direct contact was possible, when the gate was open. Unless some group somewhere maintained the knowledge intact, preserved the techniques in unbroken lineage, continued practicing the rituals, not because they worked, but because someday they might work again. There are traditions that claim exactly this. Secret societies allegedly preserving ancient wisdom, mystery schools supposedly operating in hidden locations, groups that claim unbroken lineage from Egyptian, Babylonian, or Greek mystery traditions. Most of these claims are probably false. Romantic fantasies about ancient knowledge, invented pedigrees created to give modern groups a sense of ancient authority. But possibly not all of them, because fragments of genuine ancient techniques do survive in unlikely places, encoded in Masonic ritual, preserved in Hermetic texts, hidden in alchemical symbolism, present in Kabbalistic practices. Fragments, not complete systems, but pieces of the puzzle. As if someone, somewhere, intentionally scattered the knowledge, made sure no single text or tradition contained everything, but that if someone gathered pieces from multiple sources, knew how to recognize what mattered and what was corruption, had the dedication to reconstruct the original techniques from fragmentary evidence, the gate opening procedures could be recovered, the frequencies could be calculated, the contact could be reestablished. Not through faith, through knowledge, through technical procedure based on understanding conditions required for interdimensional communication. Which brings us to the present day, to researchers translating Sumerian tablets and discovering gate-opening procedures, to scholars studying ancient mystery schools and finding technical specifications, to scientists developing theories about consciousness and quantum mechanics that sound remarkably like what ancient priests were describing in mythological language. Are we, without quite realizing it, rebuilding the knowledge the Sumerians lost, approaching the same understanding through different terminology? Are we learning to open the gates? Or have the gates been slowly opening on their own, and we're just now developing instruments sensitive enough to detect it? Because there's one more piece of this puzzle we haven't discussed yet, one more set of tablets that scholars really don't know what to do with. Tablets that don't describe the past, that describe the future. Prophecy texts saying the gates will reopen, the Anunnaki will return, the frequency will shift back. And when it does, humanity needs to be ready, needs to remember how to establish contact, needs to have preserved the techniques despite millennia of silence, needs to still be listening, even if they stop speaking. Because the silence isn't permanent. According to these prophecy texts, it was always temporary, a test, a period of independence designed to see if humanity could maintain civilization without constant supervision. And the test has an end date, calculated using astronomical cycles, precession of the equinoxes, the great year, 26,000 years from the gates closing, which, according to some calculations based on Sumerian astronomical texts, puts the reopening somewhere around now. Our time, our generation, the age when the gates should be opening again. If the ancient prophecies were accurate, if the astronomical calculations were correct, if the Anunnaki intended to return and not just withdraw permanently. If. But what if they were right? What if we're living in the age of reopening? What if the silence is ending? Would we recognize it? Do we remember the signs? Have we preserved enough of the ancient knowledge to understand what's happening? Or did we lose something crucial when the mystery schools closed? When the last priests who understood the gate opening procedures died without passing on complete knowledge? These are the questions that haunt the late-night reading of Sumerian tablets. The questions that emerge when you sit in museum archives, handling clay that's 4,000 years old, reading words pressed into it by people who believed they were living through the end of an age and needed to leave messages for those who would live at its beginning again. Messages saying they didn't leave forever, they changed frequency. Learn to listen at the right range and you'll hear them again. The gates can reopen, but you need to remember how. We're still trying to remember, still translating tablets, still reconstructing rituals, still attempting to understand what the Sumerians knew about contact between human consciousness and something they called the Anunnaki. Still listening for a signal from a transmitter that went silent 2,000 years before Rome fell. Still wondering if the silence was the message, or if the message is still coming, on a frequency we don't yet know how to detect. But we're learning, slowly, piecing together fragments, building understanding from ruins, doing exactly what the ancient tablets say we should be doing, preparing for reopening, maintaining the vigil. Still listening, just in case they're still speaking, at a frequency we haven't yet learned to hear. The frequency that changed, that's waiting to change back. When the cycle completes, when the great year ends and begins again, when the conditions align precisely as they did when contact was first established, when the gates open and the Anunnaki return to find humanity still listening, still remembering, still ready for the conversation to resume. If we haven't forgotten too much, if we've preserved enough, if we're paying attention when the signal comes through. That's the promise hidden in the tablets. That's the hope preserved through 4,000 years of silence. Not that they left, but that they're still there, at a frequency we lost the ability to detect but that we can relearn. The gates aren't destroyed, they're closed. There's a difference. Closed means they can open again. All we need is the right key, the right frequency, the right understanding of how the gate operates. And somewhere in these tablets, in these fragments, in these scattered pieces of ancient knowledge, the key remains, waiting to be found by those with ears to hear and the dedication to listen through silence. Interlude: the sound of silence. Before we move forward to modern echoes, let's pause here, rest in this moment, the deepest part of our journey through ancient memory. You're lying down now, I hope, comfortable. The room around you is dark or dim. Maybe there's a fan humming in the background, white noise, ocean sounds, rain, whatever helps you drift. And as you settle deeper into that drift, consider what we've explored so far. Direct divine presence fading into distant memory, gates closing, frequencies shifting, knowledge preserved across impossible timescales by people who never expected to see results from their dedication. 4,000 years of priests climbing stone steps at dawn, performing rituals that didn't work, maintaining techniques that no longer produced contact, copying tablets from tablets, passing knowledge forward through generations, through empires rising and falling, through languages living and dying, through civilizations that couldn't have imagined us but served us anyway. That's devotion, real devotion, not to gods who answer prayers, but to the possibility that someday, somehow, the gates might open again. And when they do, humanity will be ready because someone somewhere kept the knowledge alive. Close your eyes now, deep breath in, slow breath out. Imagine you're standing in the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Babylonian collection. It's after hours. The building is empty. You're alone with 30,000 clay tablets in climate-controlled darkness. Each tablet was pressed by human hands, Fingers that felt the same things you feel: hunger, love, fear, hope. People who looked up at the same stars you see and wondered about the same mysteries that brought you to this video tonight. They wrote on clay because they wanted their words to survive. They baked it hard because they knew stone erodes and wood burns and flesh decays, but fired clay endures. They were writing to you, specifically to you, 4,000 years into a future they couldn't imagine, to a person they would never meet, in a language they'd never heard, living in a civilization they couldn't conceive. They wrote to you anyway and said, "Keep listening." That message survived everything: wars, plagues, empires collapsing, languages dying, religions replacing religions, technologies transforming beyond recognition, climate shifts, social upheaval, 4,000 years of human chaos. And the tablets remain, in museums across America, in universities, in private collections, in archaeological sites still unexcavated beneath Iraqi sand. Waiting to be read, waiting to deliver their message. Keep listening. You're listening now. That's why you're here. Something in you responds to these ancient questions. Something recognizes the importance of the vigil, even if you can't articulate why. That something is the part of your consciousness that operates outside normal awareness. The quantum self, maybe. The deeper layers of mind that modern science barely acknowledges, but that ancient mystery schools spent millennia training. The part that knows, without needing proof, that reality has more dimensions than you directly perceive. That consciousness can tune to different frequencies. That gates exist, even if they're currently closed. That part of you has been listening all along, through your entire life, through all your ancestors' lives, back through countless generations to people who directly experienced what you're trying to understand. You carry their memory, in your DNA perhaps, in collective unconscious maybe, in subtle patterns of consciousness that neuroscience hasn't yet learned to measure. You carry the memory of when the gates were open, when contact was direct, when the frequency was in range. And you carry the longing for that contact to be reestablished, the grief of separation, the hope of reunion. That's why these stories affect you, why ancient mysteries pull at your attention, why you're listening to a 2-hour video about Sumerian tablets when you could be doing anything else. Something in you remembers, and wants to remember more fully, wants to recover what was lost, wants to reopen what was closed. That's natural. That's human. That's the longing the Sumerians felt when their gods fell silent. That's the grief the mystery schools addressed with their initiations. That's the absence every religious tradition tries to fill with its own answers. The longing for contact with something larger than yourself, something ancient and wise and real. The Sumerians called it the Anunnaki. We call it by different names. The divine, the absolute, the transcendent, universal consciousness, the ground of being. Different words, same longing, same sense that reality includes dimensions we can't normally access, but that remain present nonetheless. That silence isn't emptiness but signal at a frequency beyond our current range. Breathe deeply, slowly. Let your body relax completely. That signal exists, right now, transmitting constantly, at frequencies that require specific states of consciousness to detect. You're approaching one of those states, the boundary between waking and sleeping, the threshold state where normal sensory processing quiets and other modes of perception become accessible. This is when the ancient mystery schools did their work. In these liminal states, dawn and dusk, the edge of sleep, moments when the gate between dimensions becomes slightly more permeable. Not magic, neuroscience would explain it differently. Brain waves shifting, default mode network quieting, different neural networks activating, consciousness mode switching in ways that allow processing of information normally filtered out. But the effect is what matters. These threshold states allow perception of things hidden during normal waking consciousness. The mystery schools knew this. The Sumerians knew this. Every wisdom tradition knows this. So they developed techniques, not to create experiences, but to allow perception of what's always present but usually hidden. You're using one of those techniques right now. This video, this long, slow exploration of ancient mysteries designed to occupy your thinking mind while your deeper consciousness drifts free. Designed to help you cross the threshold, to enter the liminal state where perception expands beyond normal bounds. Where you might hear something, feel something, sense something that's been transmitting all along at a frequency your waking mind can't detect. Not the Anunnaki necessarily, not gods in any traditional sense, but something, some dimension of reality that your consciousness can access when conditions are right. When you're relaxed, when you're receptive, when you're listening without expectation or demand. When you're in exactly the state you're approaching now, the edge of sleep, the threshold, the gate. Rest there on the threshold, not quite awake, not quite asleep. In between, where reality is fluid, where consciousness expands, where perception includes dimensions normally hidden. Listen there, with ears beyond ears, attention beyond attention, awareness that includes but transcends normal sensory input. Listen for the signal that's been transmitting since the Sumerians first fell silent, since the gates closed, since the frequency shifted out of normal range. Listen for the Anunnaki who never left, who exist at frequencies we lost the ability to detect but that we might, in these threshold states, briefly perceive again. Or don't listen for anything specific. Just rest in openness, in receptivity, in the understanding that reality includes more than you normally perceive. That's enough. That's the whole practice. Opening to possibility, remaining receptive to signal from unexpected sources. That's what the Sumerians did when direct contact ended. They remained open, remained receptive, continued listening even when nothing seemed to be speaking. And sometimes they reported in threshold states, in moments of special receptivity, they heard something, received something, perceived something that gave them information they couldn't have obtained through normal means. Information about astronomy, mathematics, medicine, architecture, knowledge that seemed to come from somewhere beyond their individual minds. Were they accessing the Anunnaki, or accessing deeper levels of their own consciousness? Or are those the same thing ultimately? We don't know, can't know from where we are now, can only wonder, can only remain open to possibilities, can only keep listening, as the Sumerians listened, as the mystery school initiates listened, as every generation has listened, hopping to hear something, preparing for the moment when the signal becomes clear again. That moment might be now. This threshold state you're entering might be exactly the condition required to hear what's been transmitting all along. Or it might be simple rest, simple sleep, simple peace without any cosmic revelation. That's fine too, that's enough. Sometimes the vigil is just the vigil, maintaining readiness without result, keeping watch without event, being present without receiving. That has value, real value, demonstrating that you care enough to keep trying, to remain open, to stay receptive even when reception is silent. The universe notices. Reality pays attention. Call it God, call it consciousness, call it quantum fields. Something out there recognizes real dedication. It rewards stubbornness. It gives fresh insight to the ones who stick with it, who stay open and patient. Maybe not tonight, maybe not this year, maybe not even while you're alive. Still, the vigil matters. Every bit of effort joins 4,000 years of people trying to crack open doors that shut in ancient Sumer. Your mind adds to a huge network running through time. All of you tuned to the same signal, hopping for the same breakthrough, serving the same project, reconnection. You're part of that now, whether you planned on it or not, just by being here, just by listening, just by wanting to know. You've joined the watch. You've added your awareness to the mix. You've offered your piece to a puzzle that began long before you were born and won't end when you're gone. That's beautiful, that matters, that's enough. So rest, really rest. You've done your part, you kept the vigil. Let sleep come over you. Let dreams rise up. Let your mind wander into places you can't reach when you're wide awake. And if somewhere in those dreams, in those deep, quiet spaces, you pick up something, remember it. Even if it's strange, even if it feels like nonsense. The Sumerians got their knowledge in dreams after the gates closed, in visions, in those in-between moments when normal thinking faded and something deeper came through. Maybe those were just dreams, maybe just symbols the mind cooked up. Or maybe dreams were the only way knowledge slipped through after direct contact stopped, the last open channel when everything else went quiet. Your dreams tonight could be just dreams, your brain sorting out the day, firing off random signals. Or maybe there's more to them. Maybe there's a signal in the static. Maybe you'll pick up something the Sumerians would have called a message from the gods. We can't know for sure. All we can do is stay open, pay attention, listen. Always listening, even in sleep, especially in sleep. That's the heart of the teaching, the last lesson, the final memory the Sumerians carried before the silence. Keep listening, through every state, through every silence. The signal never stopped. We just lost the knack of picking it up, but in those edge-of-sleep moments, in the liminal spaces, the signal's still there, the gate's still waiting, the Anunnaki never really left. You just need the right conditions to tune in, and you're creating those conditions right now, letting yourself drift towards sleep. So rest, listen, stay open. You're doing what thousands before you have done, what the Sumerians taught, what the old mystery schools try to keep alive. Hold the vigil, keep the watch, listen through the silence. Wait for the silence to break, wait for the gate to open, wait for the signal to come back into range. Soon or eventually. If we keep listening, and we always do, because that's what humans are made for. That's what we've always done. That's the old Sumerian wisdom. Keep listening. Always. No matter what. Until contact returns. Until we understand. Until reconnection happens. Rest now, dream deep. Listen close. The vigil goes on. Through you. Through all of us. As long as it takes. Until the Anunnaki tune back to us. Or until we figure out how to reach them. Whichever comes first. Soon. Sleep well. Part 4. Modern Echoes in Ancient Silence. Here's something to chew on. Back in 1993, researchers at the University of California stumbled onto something odd in human DNA. Not mutations or errors exactly, but what they called junk DNA. Big stretches that didn't seem to do anything. No obvious purpose, just hanging around taking up space. For about 20 years, most scientists figured this was just evolutionary leftovers. Useless baggage from humanity's past, fossilized in our genes but not actually doing a job. Dead weight. Then in 2012, everything flipped. Turns out, this so-called junk wasn't junk at all. It was regulatory code. Basically, it's the system that tells functional genes when to switch on and off. Imagine it as the operating system running behind the scenes, while the rest of our DNA does the flashy stuff. It was always there. We just didn't have the right tools to see what it was doing. Now, I'm not saying genetics and ancient religion are the same thing, but look at the pattern. Something present but invisible until our tech catches up. We thought it was nothing. Turns out, it's running the show once you know how to look. So what if the Anunnaki, the ancient gods from Sumerian stories, didn't actually disappear? What if they just shifted to a reality we couldn't pick up with our old school senses? Not gone, just out of reach. Maybe it's a matter of needing better detection, not just better eyesight or hearing. The Sumerian tablets actually spell this out. They never say the gods vanished. They talk about the gods retreating to the high place, the exalted dwelling, or behind the veil. All of these sound like there's something right here, but hidden behind a kind of barrier. And what if that barrier isn't all smoke and poetry? What if it's dimensional, not mystical but technical? Modern physics is totally fine with extra dimensions. String theory says we need 11 for the math to work out. M theory calls for even more. These aren't just wild ideas. They're baked into the equations that explain what we see. Thing is, most of these dimensions are curled up so tiny we can't reach them. They're everywhere, shaping our world but invisible, because we just don't have the senses or equipment to notice. Now imagine trying to explain this to someone in 2000 BCE. How do you talk about beings living in places you can't see or touch, but that still mess with your world? You'd probably say they went to a high place or hid behind a veil. That's how people talk about things they can't describe directly. You'd use space and distance as metaphors because that's what makes sense. And then you'd start inventing rituals, ways of trying to pierce that barrier, paying attention to the weird times and places when contact seemed possible. Which, if you read the old Sumerian texts, is exactly what they did. I'm not saying the Anunnaki were aliens from another dimension, but it's striking how much their stories line up with how we might describe extra dimensions if we didn't have modern science at our fingertips. And here, where it gets even weirder. In 2007, a team at Princeton's Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory, yeah, Princeton, not some fringe outfit, wrapped up 30 years of experiments on how human consciousness might affect quantum systems. They ran trials with random number generators. Sometimes, it looked like focused intention could nudge the results away from pure chance. The effects were tiny, barely noticeable, but they showed up again and again, thousands of times, like consciousness could reach into quantum reality and poke it, just a little. The lab shut down in 2007, partly because their results made the mainstream uneasy. Still, the data's out there. Thousands of experiments suggesting consciousness might touch the physical world at quantum levels, in ways we can't explain yet. Quantum mechanics already tells us that watching changes things. The famous double-slit experiment shows particles act differently when you're looking. That's not mysticism. It's solid physics. The real question now is whether consciousness itself is what makes the difference when we observe. But imagine for a moment that it does. That properly trained consciousness can interact with quantum-level reality in measurable ways. That altering your consciousness, through meditation, fasting, specific practices, could potentially affect your relationship with quantum fields in ways that open perception to information normally hidden. Sound familiar? It's what every mystery school taught. Techniques for altering consciousness to perceive hidden realms. Not magic, not mysticism. Technical procedures for tuning human consciousness to detect information at frequencies normally beyond its range. The Eleusinian mysteries lasted nearly 2,000 years, and almost everyone who experienced them, philosophers, generals, emperors, described it as the most profound experience of their lives. They weren't fools or dupes. Something happened in that underground chamber at Eleusis during the initiations. Either mass hallucinations sustained for 2 millennia, or a genuine technique for altering consciousness in ways that provided access to information or experiences normally unavailable. And the descriptions of what initiates experienced at Eleusis match descriptions from Sumerian texts about descent to the house of wisdom, contact with divine presence, direct knowledge transmission, experiences that transformed understanding permanently. Different culture, different language, different era, same core descriptions. As if the techniques the Sumerians developed for opening the gate, for achieving contact after the Anunnaki withdrew, were preserved and transmitted through mystery schools for thousands of years. encoded in ritual procedures that looked like religion but were actually technology for consciousness modification. Technology we've largely lost, but that modern research into consciousness and quantum mechanics might be beginning to rediscover through different methodology. In 2019, researchers at the University of California, Santa Barbara, demonstrated quantum entanglement in a system large enough to be visible to the naked eye. Not just subatomic particles, but a piece of metal vibrating in two quantum states simultaneously. Macroscale quantum behavior, observable without specialized instruments. The barrier between quantum and classical reality isn't as absolute as we thought. Under the right conditions, quantum effects can scale up to sizes and energies we can directly perceive. What if consciousness works similarly? What if under the right conditions, proper training, specific practices, particular neurochemical states, consciousness can perceive or interact with levels of reality normally hidden by the sensory limits of our default state? What if the gate-opening procedures weren't superstition but technology? Crude technology, lacking our theoretical understanding, but functional nonetheless. Methods that worked through trial and error over thousands of years, producing consistent results that the practitioners attributed to divine contact, because they had no other framework for understanding what was happening. This isn't saying the Anunnaki weren't real. It's suggesting they might have been real in ways the ancient Sumerians couldn't fully comprehend, so described them in language that mixed observation with interpretation. They observed. Gods were present, then less present, then accessible only through specific techniques. They interpreted. The gods withdrew to a higher realm and taught us procedures to reach them there. Modern interpretation. Beings existing in dimensions or at frequencies beyond normal human perception became less accessible for some reason. But they left behind techniques, encoded in ritual, preserved in mystery traditions, for achieving temporary perceptual access to their realm. Same data, different explanatory framework. The crucial point, the silence might not be absence. It might be presence at a frequency we're not currently tuned to detect. And the ancient texts, the gate-opening procedures, the mystery school techniques, they might be instructions for tuning human consciousness to perceive that frequency. Instructions we've mostly lost or forgotten, but that we're perhaps beginning to rediscover through research into consciousness, quantum mechanics, and the observer effect. There's a researcher at the University of Arizona, Dr. Stuart Hameroff, who's proposed that consciousness arises from quantum processes in cellular structures called microtubules. He suggests consciousness isn't generated by neurons firing, but by quantum effects in the protein structures that make up cellular architecture. His theory is controversial. Most neuroscientists reject it, but if he's even partially correct, it means consciousness operates at quantum scales, which means techniques for altering consciousness might allow interaction with quantum-level reality in ways we're only beginning to understand. Which would mean the ancient mystery schools were onto something, not metaphorically. Actually, they were developing techniques for consciousness modification that allowed perceptual access to quantum-level information. They didn't understand it in those terms. They used language about divine realms and spiritual transformation, but they might have been describing real effects using the vocabulary available to them. Effects that modern quantum consciousness research is starting to approach from a different direction, with different language, but potentially discovering the same phenomena. Now, I'm being very careful here. I'm not claiming ancient priests were quantum physicists. I'm not saying Sumerian rituals were scientifically validated consciousness technology. I'm pointing out patterns, similarities between what ancient texts describe and what modern research is discovering. Parallels that suggest the ancients might have been working with real phenomena they didn't fully understand, just as we're currently working with quantum effects we don't fully understand. And the most intriguing parallel, both ancient texts and modern research suggest reality has layers, levels of existence beyond what we directly perceive. Information accessible through specific techniques or technologies but hidden otherwise. The ancients called these layers divine realms and developed consciousness-altering techniques to access them. We call them quantum fields and developed mathematical tools to describe them. Different approaches to the same underlying reality, possibly. And if so, that means the gate opening procedures weren't primitive superstition. They were early attempts at technology we're now approaching from a different angle. Early attempts that might have worked better than we assume. Because the people using them, the initiates at Eleusis, the priests descending to Enki's chamber, the mystery school adepts across the ancient world, consistently reported profound experiences that transformed their understanding of reality. Were they all delusional, experiencing self-generated hallucinations with no external component? Or were they accessing something real, information or experiences that exist at levels of reality we don't normally perceive, but that become accessible through specific techniques for consciousness modification? Modern research can't answer that question yet. We don't understand consciousness well enough. We don't know what it is, where it comes from, or what it's capable of accessing. But the ancient texts suggest our ancestors spent thousands of years developing practical techniques for consciousness modification that produced consistent, reproducible results. Techniques they valued so highly they preserved them through political upheaval, cultural transformation, and religious persecution. Why preserve techniques that don't work? Why maintain elaborate training programs for procedures that produce nothing? Unless they did work. Not perfectly, not consistently, but often enough to justify the effort of preservation. Work to do what, according to the texts, establish contact with the Anunnaki, open the gates, perceive the divine realm, access hidden knowledge. According to a modern interpretation, modify consciousness to perceive information at frequencies beyond normal human sensory range. Create temporary access to levels of reality normally hidden. Tune human awareness to detect signals from somewhere else. Same phenomenon, different interpretation. And here's the truly haunting possibility. What if both interpretations are partially correct? What if the Anunnaki were real entities, existing in dimensions or at frequencies beyond normal human perception? And what if the gate-opening techniques were legitimate methods for achieving temporary perceptual access to those dimensions? Not gods in the supernatural sense, not aliens from another planet, but something weirder. Beings existing in aspects of reality we're only now developing the physics to describe. Dimensions we're only now accepting as mathematically necessary. Beings that could interact with our dimension when conditions were right, when natural or artificially created circumstances made the dimensional boundary permeable, when human consciousness reached states that allowed perception across that boundary. Beings that the Sumerians encountered and called the Anunnaki, that taught humanity agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, urban planning, not through supernatural intervention, but through a form of communication we're still trying to understand. And then something changed. The boundary became less permeable. Direct contact became impossible. The Anunnaki, whether by choice or circumstance, could no longer manifest in our dimension in ways we could directly perceive. But they left instructions, encoded in ritual, preserved in texts, maintained through mystery schools. Instructions for artificially creating the conditions that allowed temporary perceptual access despite the dimensional barrier. Instructions that mostly worked in the centuries immediately after the withdrawal. That became less effective as time passed and conditions continued changing. That eventually stopped working altogether, producing at best occasional glimpses that could be attributed to hallucination or self-delusion. Until now, When quantum mechanics and consciousness research are approaching the same questions from different angles, when we're developing theoretical frameworks that might finally explain what the ancients were actually experiencing, when we might be on the verge of understanding how to deliberately open the gates, not through ritual, but through technology informed by quantum physics and neuroscience, when we might be capable of reestablishing contact, if the Anunnaki are still there, at whatever frequency they exist, if they're listening from their side of the dimensional boundary, if they've been waiting for humanity to develop sufficient understanding to reach them, without requiring the gates to be opened from above. This is speculation. I want to be clear about that. I'm connecting dots between Sumerian texts, mystery school traditions, and modern physics in ways that most academics would find problematic. But the dots are there. The patterns exist. The similarities between ancient descriptions and modern discoveries are too consistent to dismiss entirely. Something happened in ancient Sumer. Direct divine presence faded, gates closed, silence began. And humanity spent 4,000 years trying to reopen those gates, trying to reestablish contact, trying to understand what had changed and how to reverse it. Maybe they were chasing illusions. Maybe the Anunnaki were never real, just myths explaining natural phenomena. Or maybe they were real, and the silence isn't permanent, and we're living in the age when the barriers might finally be understood well enough to cross deliberately, when the frequency might shift back to a range we can detect, or when we develop the technology to reach their frequency ourselves. The ancient texts suggest this was always the plan. That withdrawal was intended to force humanity to develop independently, to build the knowledge base necessary to eventually understand dimensional reality and establish contact deliberately rather than passively receiving it. If that's true, we're right on schedule. 4,000 years to go from mystery school rituals to quantum mechanics, from consciousness-altering techniques based on trial and error to neuroscience, understanding how consciousness emerges from quantum processes. From seeing the Anunnaki as supernatural gods to potentially understanding them as dimensional entities existing in aspects of reality, we're only now learning to detect. Understanding isn't the same as contact, but it's the necessary first step. You can't deliberately communicate with something until you understand what it is and how it operates. The Sumerians understood how to open gates. We're beginning to understand what the gates are. Combine that ancient practical knowledge with modern theoretical understanding, and maybe the frequency shifts back. Maybe we learn to listen at the right range. Maybe the silence ends. Or maybe it already has, and we just don't recognize the signal yet. Because we're looking for the wrong things, expecting gods descending from the sky, not information emerging from quantum fields. Expecting supernatural intervention, not natural phenomena at scales and frequencies we're barely beginning to perceive. The Anunnaki never left. They just shifted to a frequency we lost the ability to detect. And the Sumerians' last memory before silence was the instruction to keep listening, keep developing knowledge, keep refining techniques, keep working toward understanding that would eventually make contact possible again. We're still following those instructions, still working toward understanding, still developing the knowledge base, still listening, even if we don't realize that's what we're doing. The gates are closed, but closed isn't the same as locked. And somewhere in the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern science, the key remains, waiting for us to recognize it, waiting for us to understand what we're looking at, waiting for us to finally hear the signal that's been transmitting the entire time. We thought we were listening to silence. In 2019, researchers at the University of California, Santa Barbara, demonstrated quantum entanglement in a system large enough to be visible to the naked eye. Not just subatomic particles, but a piece of metal vibrating in two quantum states simultaneously. macroscale quantum behavior, observable without specialized instruments. The barrier between quantum and classical reality isn't as absolute as we thought. Under the right conditions, quantum effects can scale up to sizes and energies we can directly perceive. What if consciousness works similarly? What if under the right conditions, proper training, specific practices, particular neurochemical states, consciousness can perceive or interact with levels of reality normally hidden by the sensory limits of our default state? What if the gate-opening procedures weren't superstition but technology? Crude technology, lacking our theoretical understanding, but functional nonetheless. Methods that worked through trial and error over thousands of years, producing consistent results that the practitioners attributed to divine contact, because they had no other framework for understanding what was happening. This isn't saying the Anunnaki weren't real. It's suggesting they might have been real in ways the ancient Sumerians couldn't fully comprehend, so described them in language that mixed observation with interpretation. They observed. Gods were present, then less present, then accessible only through specific techniques. They interpreted. The gods withdrew to a higher realm and taught us procedures to reach them there. Modern interpretation. Beings existing in dimensions or at frequencies beyond normal human perception became less accessible for some reason. But they left behind techniques, encoded in ritual, preserved in mystery traditions, for achieving temporary perceptual access to their realm. Same data, different explanatory framework. The crucial point, the silence might not be absence. It might be presence at a frequency we're not currently tuned to detect. And the ancient texts, the gate-opening procedures, the mystery school techniques, they might be instructions for tuning human consciousness to perceive that frequency. Instructions we've mostly lost or forgotten, but that we're perhaps beginning to rediscover through research into consciousness, quantum mechanics, and the observer effect. There's a researcher at the University of Arizona, Dr. Stuart Hameroff, who's proposed that consciousness arises from quantum processes in cellular structures called microtubules. He suggests consciousness isn't generated by neurons firing, but by quantum effects in the protein structures that make up cellular architecture. His theory is controversial. Most neuroscientists reject it, but if he's even partially correct, it means consciousness operates at quantum scales, which means techniques for altering consciousness might allow interaction with quantum-level reality in ways we're only beginning to understand. Which would mean the ancient mystery schools were onto something. Not metaphorically. Actually, they were developing techniques for consciousness modification that allowed perceptual access to quantum-level information. They didn't understand it in those terms. They used language about divine realms and spiritual transformation, but they might have been describing real effects using the vocabulary available to them. Effects that modern quantum consciousness research is starting to approach from a different direction, with different language, but potentially discovering the same phenomena. Now, I'm being very careful here. I'm not claiming ancient priests were quantum physicists. I'm not saying Sumerian rituals were scientifically validated consciousness technology. I'm seeing patterns here, real echoes between what ancient texts describe and what modern science is stumbling onto. It's like the ancients brushed up against real phenomena they couldn't quite explain, the same way we're poking at quantum effects now, still mostly in the dark. But the wildest parallel, both the old stories and cutting-edge research hint that reality isn't flat. There are layers to it, levels of existence hidden from our everyday senses. Sometimes you can reach these layers if you know the right techniques or have the right tools. Otherwise, they stay out of sight. Ancient people called these layers divine realms. They came up with all sorts of ways, rituals, altered states, you name it, to reach them. Today, we talk about quantum fields and invent math to describe what we can't see. Are we all just circling around the same mystery but with different words? Maybe. If that's true, then maybe those ancient gate opening rituals weren't just superstition. Maybe they were the first drafts of a technology we're only now reimagining. And honestly, maybe they worked better than we give them credit for. Because the people using them, the initiates at Eleusis, the priests in Enki's temple, the adepts from 100 old mystery schools, they kept coming back with experiences that changed the way they saw everything. Were they all just fooling themselves, having elaborate hallucinations with no real external cause? Or did they tap into something real? Did they find ways to access information or experiences hiding just outside normal perception, available only when you tweak consciousness in just the right way? Modern science doesn't have an answer. We still don't get what consciousness really is, where it comes from, or what it's capable of. But if you read the old texts, you see our ancestors spent centuries fine-tuning techniques for shifting consciousness. And these methods worked often enough that people risked everything to keep them alive through wars, regime changes, and religious crackdowns. Why bother keeping a tradition alive if it's empty? Why run secret schools, pass down complex training if nothing ever happens? Unless sometimes something did happen. Maybe not always, maybe not perfectly, but enough to be worth the trouble. What were they trying to do? The texts say, contact the Anunnaki, open the gates, see the divine realm, get knowledge hidden from ordinary eyes. Today, we'd put it differently. Change consciousness so you can pick up information at frequencies outside normal senses. Get a peek into layers of reality that are usually locked away. Tune the mind to signals coming from somewhere else. It's the same mystery, just dressed up with new language. And here's the question that sticks with me. What if both the old and new explanations have some truth? What if the Anunnaki were real, not gods, not aliens, but something stranger? Beings living in slices of reality we're only now starting to describe with physics. Dimensions our equations say have to exist, but that we can't see. Maybe when the conditions were right, when the world or the mind lined up just so, those beings could step across the boundary, or we could reach across. The Sumerians met them, called them Anunnaki. They didn't just watch. They taught people how to farm, do math, study the stars, build cities. Not through magic, but through a type of contact we still don't really get. At some point, though, things shifted. The boundary thickened. Direct contact faded. The Anunnaki, for whatever reason, couldn't cross over anymore. But they left instructions behind. Rituals, texts, secret teachings, ways to recreate the conditions for contact. Those instructions worked for a while. Over time, they got weaker. Eventually, they barely worked at all, and people brushed off the last glimpses as simple hallucination. Now, though, quantum physics and consciousness research are circling the same questions from different sides. We're finally building the tools and theories that might let us understand what the ancients were actually experiencing. When we might be on the verge of understanding how to deliberately open the gates, not through ritual, but through technology informed by quantum physics and neuroscience. When we might be capable of reestablishing contact, if the Anunnaki are still there, at whatever frequency they exist. If they're listening from their side of the dimensional boundary. If they've been waiting for humanity to develop sufficient understanding to reach them, without requiring the gates to be opened from above. This is speculation. I want to be clear about that. I'm connecting dots between Sumerian texts, mystery school traditions, and modern physics in ways that most academics would find problematic. But the dots are there. The patterns exist. The similarities between ancient descriptions and modern discoveries are too consistent to dismiss entirely. Something happened in ancient Sumer. Direct divine presence faded, gates closed, silence began. And humanity spent 4,000 years trying to reopen those gates, trying to reestablish contact, trying to understand what had changed and how to reverse it. Maybe they were chasing illusions. Maybe the Anunnaki were never real, just myths explaining natural phenomena. Or maybe they were real, and the silence isn't permanent, and we're living in the age when the barriers might finally be understood well enough to cross deliberately. When the frequency might shift back to a range we can detect, or when we develop the technology to reach their frequency ourselves. The ancient texts suggest this was always the plan. That withdrawal was intended to force humanity to develop independently, to build the knowledge base necessary to eventually understand dimensional reality and establish contact deliberately rather than passively receiving it. If that's true, we're right on schedule. 4,000 years to go from mystery school rituals to quantum mechanics, from consciousness-altering techniques based on trial and error to neuroscience, understanding how consciousness emerges from quantum processes. From seeing the Anunnaki as supernatural gods to potentially understanding them as dimensional entities existing in aspects of reality, we're only now learning to detect. Understanding isn't the same as contact, but it's the necessary first step. You can't deliberately communicate with something until you understand what it is and how it operates. The Sumerians understood how to open gates. We're beginning to understand what the gates are. Combine that ancient practical knowledge with modern theoretical understanding, and maybe the frequency shifts back. Maybe we learn to listen at the right range. Maybe the silence ends. Or maybe it already has, and we just don't recognize the signal yet. Because we're looking for the wrong things, expecting gods descending from the sky, not information emerging from quantum fields. Expecting supernatural intervention, not natural phenomena at scales and frequencies we're barely beginning to perceive. The Anunnaki never left. They just shifted to a frequency we lost the ability to detect. And the Sumerians' last memory before silence was the instruction to keep listening, keep developing knowledge, keep refining techniques, keep working toward understanding that would eventually make contact possible again. We're still following those instructions, still working toward understanding, still developing the knowledge base, still listening, even if we don't realize that's what we're doing. The gates are closed, but closed isn't the same as locked. And somewhere in the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern science, the key remains, waiting for us to recognize it, waiting for us to understand what we're looking at, waiting for us to finally hear the signal that's been transmitting the entire time. We thought we were listening to silence. In 2019, researchers at the University of California, Santa Barbara, demonstrated quantum entanglement in a system large enough to be visible to the naked eye. Not just subatomic particles, but a piece of metal vibrating in two quantum states simultaneously. Macroscale quantum behavior, observable without specialized instruments. The barrier between quantum and classical reality isn't as absolute as we thought. Under the right conditions, quantum effects can scale up to sizes and energies we can directly perceive. What if consciousness works similarly? What if under the right conditions, proper training, specific practices, particular neurochemical states, consciousness can perceive or interact with levels of reality normally hidden by the sensory limits of our default state? What if the gate-opening procedures weren't superstition but technology? Crude technology, lacking our theoretical understanding, but functional nonetheless. Methods that worked through trial and error over thousands of years, producing consistent results that the practitioners attributed to divine contact, because they had no other framework for understanding what was happening. This isn't saying the Anunnaki weren't real. It's suggesting they might have been real in ways the ancient Sumerians couldn't fully comprehend, so described them in language that mixed observation with interpretation. They observed. Gods were present, then less present, then accessible only through specific techniques. They interpreted. The gods withdrew to a higher realm and taught us procedures to reach them there. Modern interpretation. Beings existing in dimensions or at frequencies beyond normal human perception became less accessible for some reason. But they left behind techniques, encoded in ritual, preserved in mystery traditions, for achieving temporary perceptual access to their realm. Same data, different explanatory framework. The crucial point: the silence might not be absence. It might be presence at a frequency we're not currently tuned to detect. And the ancient texts, the gate opening procedures, the mystery school techniques, they might be instructions for tuning human consciousness to perceive that frequency. Instructions we've mostly lost or forgotten, but that we're perhaps beginning to rediscover through research into consciousness, quantum mechanics, and the observer effect. There's a researcher at the University of Arizona, Dr. Stuart Hameroff, who's proposed that consciousness arises from quantum processes in cellular structures called microtubules. He suggests consciousness isn't generated by neurons firing, but by quantum effects in the protein structures that make up cellular architecture. His theory is controversial. Most neuroscientists reject it, but if he's even partially correct, it means consciousness operates at quantum scales, which means techniques for altering consciousness might allow interaction with quantum-level reality in ways we're only beginning to understand. Which would mean the ancient mystery schools were onto something, not metaphorically. Actually, they were developing techniques for consciousness modification that allowed perceptual access to quantum-level information. They didn't understand it in those terms. They used language about divine realms and spiritual transformation, but they might have been describing real effects using the vocabulary available to them. Effects that modern quantum consciousness research is starting to approach from a different direction, with different language, but potentially discovering the same phenomena. Now, I'm being very careful here. I'm not claiming ancient priests were quantum physicists. I'm not saying Sumerian rituals were scientifically validated consciousness technology. I'm seeing patterns here, real echoes between what ancient texts describe and what modern science is stumbling onto. It's like the ancients brushed up against real phenomena they couldn't quite explain, the same way we're poking at quantum effects now, still mostly in the dark. But the wildest parallel: both the old stories and cutting-edge research hint that reality isn't flat. There are layers to it, levels of existence hidden from our everyday senses. Sometimes you can reach these layers if you know the right techniques or have the right tools. Otherwise, they stay out of sight. Ancient people called these layers divine realms. They came up with all sorts of ways, rituals, altered states. You name it to reach them. Today, we talk about quantum fields and invent math to describe what we can't see. Are we all just circling around the same mystery but with different words? Maybe. If that's true, then maybe those ancient gate-opening rituals weren't just superstition. Maybe they were the first drafts of a technology we're only now reimagining. And honestly, maybe they worked better than we give them credit for. Because the people using them, the initiates at Eleusis, the priests in Enki's temple, the adepts from 100 old mystery schools, they kept coming back with experiences that changed the way they saw everything. Were they all just fooling themselves, having elaborate hallucinations with no real external cause? Or did they tap into something real? Did they find ways to access information or experiences hiding just outside normal perception, available only when you tweak consciousness in just the right way? Modern science doesn't have an answer. We still don't get what consciousness really is, where it comes from, or what it's capable of. But if you read the old texts, you see our ancestors spent centuries fine-tuning techniques for shifting consciousness. And these methods worked often enough that people risked everything to keep them alive through wars, regime changes, and religious crackdowns. Why bother keeping a tradition alive if it's empty? Why run secret schools, pass down complex training if nothing ever happens? Unless sometimes something did happen, Maybe not always, maybe not perfectly, but enough to be worth the trouble. What were they trying to do? The texts say, contact the Anunnaki, open the gates, see the divine realm, get knowledge hidden from ordinary eyes. Today, we put it differently. Change consciousness so you can pick up information at frequencies outside normal senses. Get a peek into layers of reality that are usually locked away. Tune the mind to signals coming from somewhere else. It's the same mystery, just dressed up with new language. And here's the question that sticks with me. What if both the old and new explanations have some truth? What if the Anunnaki were real, not gods, not aliens, but something stranger? Beings living in slices of reality we're only now starting to describe with physics. Dimensions our equations say have to exist, but that we can't see. Maybe when the conditions were right, when the world or the mind lined up just so, those beings could step across the boundary, or we could reach across. The Sumerians met them, called them Anunnaki. They didn't just watch. They taught people how to farm, do math, study the stars, build cities. Not through magic, but through a type of contact we still don't really get. At some point, though, things shifted. The boundary thickened. Direct contact faded. The Anunnaki, for whatever reason, couldn't cross over anymore. But they left instructions behind. Rituals, texts, secret teachings, ways to recreate the conditions for contact. Closing meditation. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, rest with this thought. You're part of a story that began 5,000 years ago and isn't finished yet. You're one link in a chain stretching from ancient Eridu to the present moment and beyond into futures you'll never see. You're maintaining the vigil, just by being curious about these questions, just by wondering what the Sumerians knew, just by listening in your own way for signals from something vast and ancient and patient. The Anunnaki never left. They shifted frequency. And somewhere in your consciousness, in the deepest parts that modern science barely understands, the ability to perceive that frequency still exists. Dormant maybe, untrained but present, waiting. As you sleep tonight, that part of your consciousness operates freely, unfettered by the sensory constraints of waking life, exploring dimensions you can't access when you're focused on the physical world. Listening. And maybe, just maybe, hearing something, a signal, a whisper, an echo of the frequency that changed. Something that will surface tomorrow as a feeling, an intuition, a sudden interest in learning more, an impulse to continue exploring these questions. Something that keeps you part of the chain, part of the vigil, part of the great intergenerational project to reopen the gates. Sleep well, dream deeply, listen carefully. The Anunnaki never left, and neither should we. The vigil continues, through silence, toward understanding, toward reconnection, toward the moment when humanity finally learns to hear what's been speaking all along. At a frequency we're only now beginning to comprehend. In dimensions we're only now learning to perceive. Through gates we're only now understanding how to open. Soon, maybe, eventually, if we keep listening. And we will, because that's what the Sumerians taught us. That's their last memory before silence. Keep listening, always, even when, especially when, there seems to be nothing to hear. Because the silence isn't empty. It's just waiting for us to learn the right way to listen. Rest now. The ancient tablets are safe in their archives. The knowledge is preserved. The vigil continues. And you're part of it, whether you realize it or not. Just by being here. Just by wondering. Just by listening. Thank you for joining me on this journey through ancient memory and modern mystery. If you enjoyed this exploration, please like the video and subscribe for more late-night investigations into humanity's deepest questions. And remember, the gates are closed, not locked. The silence is deep, not absolute. And somewhere in the intersection of ancient wisdom and modern understanding, the key remains. Keep listening. Good night.